The Hells Angels biker found the little girl dragged past a fire escape, and his blow ended a nightmare in seconds. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a cold night in the city, the kind that sends chills up your spine, even when you're wrapped in layers of clothing. The sound of a Harley-Davidson echoed down the empty street, its engine growling through the silence, cutting through the mist that hung in the air. Jake Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, leaned into his bike as he cruised through the deserted alleyways, his mind wandering to a past he tried hard to forget. As he passed by an old, fire escape-strewn building, he heard something. A faint cry, a sound so desperate, it pierced through the usual noise of the city. He slowed down, his heart picking up pace. Another cry, this time louder. He followed the sound, his instincts kicking in. Turning the corner, he saw her, a little girl, no older than 8, dragged across the dirty ground, her clothes torn and face streaked with dirt and tears. She struggled to free herself, her body shaking with fear. She was caught by a man, tall and rough, with a cruel grip on her arm. Without thinking, Jake revved his engine, the roar of his bike signaling his approach. The man turned, eyes wide with shock. He barely had time to react before Jake's fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing to the pavement in an instant. The man groaned, dazed, and tried to get up, but Jake was already there, grabbing the little girl and pulling her to safety. "It's okay, kid," Jake muttered, his voice rough but gentle. The girl looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, not sure whether to trust the biker who had just knocked her attacker out cold. "You're safe now," he added, his tone softening. Jake knelt down beside her, offering his jacket to cover her trembling body. As he looked at her, something in his chest tightened. There was something about this girl, something in her eyes that reminded him of his own troubled childhood. She couldn't have been more than 8, yet the fear in her eyes made her seem far older. For a moment, he was reminded of his younger sister, how he had failed to protect her when she needed him the most. He shook off the thought. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. She sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Molly," she whispered, barely able to speak above a whisper. Jake's heart sank. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he knew one thing for sure, she wasn't safe yet. The man, still dazed on the ground, began to stir. Jake's instincts flared up again. This wasn't over. The city was a dangerous place, and there were always more people like him lurking in the shadows. "Stay close," Jake said, standing up and pulling Molly with him. He looked around, his mind racing. He needed to get her to a safe place, fast. The man on the ground was still groaning, trying to rise, but he wouldn't get far. Jake had dealt with scum like him before. He wasn't about to let Molly become another victim. As he turned to lead her down the alley, a cold breeze cut through the night. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, and Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. He wasn't about to let anyone get near Molly again. The night was far from over, and it was clear that this little girl's nightmare had only just begun. The streets were quieter now, the sounds of the city slowly fading into the background as Jake led Molly down a narrow alley, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp overhead. His heart raced, but his focus never wavered. The adrenaline that had surged through him moments ago was starting to wear off, but the urgency of the situation still gripped him. Molly walked closely beside him, her small frame trembling as she clung to the jacket he had draped over her shoulders. She didn't speak, but the silent fear in her eyes spoke volumes. Jake didn't need her to say anything. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Jake could hear the distant sound of footsteps echoing down the alley behind them, steady and deliberate. His hand instinctively went to the handle of his knife, the weight of it comforting in his grip. He didn't want to think about the fact that someone might be following them, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He couldn't risk it, not with Molly so close. "Stay close, kid," Jake murmured under his breath. Molly nodded, pressing herself even closer to him. Jake glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness. but there was no sign of anyone. Yet the feeling lingered, gnawing at him. He kept moving, his pace quickening. He had to get her to safety, and fast. They reached the end of the alley, and Jake slowed, looking both ways before stepping into the street. The neighborhood they had entered was quieter than most, the kind of place where not much ever happened, until tonight. He had hoped for a safe haven, but the sense of unease still wouldn't leave him. "This way," Jake said, guiding Molly into a building with a broken-down sign that hung loosely above the door. It was an old warehouse, abandoned years ago, but the place offered a temporary refuge. The door creaked loudly as Jake pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The warehouse smelled of dust and rust, the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. Jake knew it wouldn't be a permanent solution, but it was enough to keep Molly hidden for now. He led her to a corner near the back, away from the few windows that remained intact. "You're safe here for now," Jake told her, his voice low and reassuring. Molly looked around the dimly lit space, her eyes still wide with fear. She was silent for a moment before finally speaking. "What happened? Who was that man?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake sighed and sat down on a nearby crate, rubbing his face with one hand. "I don't know, kid. But he's gone now. And you're safe. That's all that matters." He paused, trying to find the right words. "He won't hurt you anymore. I'll make sure of it." Molly didn't seem convinced, but she nodded, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jake could see the exhaustion in her face now, the weight of everything that had happened hitting her all at once. He couldn't blame her. It was a lot for a kid to process, and it was a lot for him to handle too. His heart was still pounding, but the sense of responsibility that had kicked in when he saw her in danger hadn't faded. "What's your name, kid?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "Molly," she whispered. "Molly," Jake repeated, as if saying her name out loud made it feel more real. "Molly, listen to me. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. You're safe here, all right? Just stay here for a bit while I figure out what to do next." Molly didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. She simply nodded and curled up on the cold concrete floor, pulling the jacket tighter around her. Jake stood up, looking around the warehouse. His mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. He couldn't stay here forever. He needed to get Molly somewhere safer, somewhere with people he trusted. But the problem was, he didn't trust anyone in this city anymore. The world had changed, and so had he. He had learned long ago that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Still, he couldn't just leave Molly alone. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. The sound of a car's engine revving in the distance snapped Jake out of his thoughts. His instincts flared again. Whoever had been following them wasn't far behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. It was only a matter of time before the past caught up with him, and this little girl was caught in the middle of it. His grip tightened on the handle of his knife. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. Not again. It had been hours since Jake had brought Molly into the abandoned warehouse, and the weight of their situation pressed heavily on him. Molly had fallen asleep, curled up on the cold concrete floor, her small form barely visible in the dim light. Jake had tried to keep his mind occupied, but the thought of what might be lurking outside made it impossible to relax. He kept his eyes on the door, his senses sharp. Every small sound made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he closed his eyes, the memories of his past, the life he'd left behind, came rushing back, but he forced them away. He couldn't afford to get distracted. Not now. Molly was depending on him. As the night dragged on, the feeling of unease intensified. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, but it wasn't just the weather that kept Jake on edge. Every time he moved, his boots scraping against the floor, his thoughts raced. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. Molly deserved better. He needed to find out who the man was that had attacked her. And more importantly, he needed to make sure that no one else would come looking for her. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt her again. The idea of Molly being caught in the middle of something dangerous, something he couldn't control, stirred a deep anger inside him. He had spent his entire life in the chaos of the Hells Angels, always fighting, always running. But now, for the first time in years, he felt like there was something worth fighting for. He glanced over at Molly, her face relaxed in sleep, her small hands gripping the jacket he'd given her. She looked so innocent, so fragile, it hurt to think of what she'd been through. Jake had seen enough violence to last a lifetime. But seeing someone so young, so helpless, was a new kind of pain. He didn't know who had hurt her, but he was going to find out. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. As he paced the cold floor, trying to make sense of his next move, he heard it, the sound of tires screeching in the distance. It was the kind of sound that immediately put him on high alert. He walked to the window and peered through the cracked glass. The headlights of a car were coming down the street, growing brighter by the second. His heart skipped a beat. It could be anyone. More trouble, more people looking for Molly. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and rushed over to Molly, shaking her awake. She startled at the touch, her wide eyes scanning the darkness. "Molly, stay down," Jake whispered, his voice low and urgent. She nodded, fear evident in her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, but we need to be ready," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady. He moved quickly, pulling her further back into the warehouse, out of sight from the approaching car. His mind raced, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the edge of something he couldn't control. He'd spent years avoiding responsibility, avoiding ties to anything that could keep him in one place. But now, with Molly's safety on the line, everything felt different. He couldn't let her down. He wasn't going to be the kind of man who walked away from someone who needed him. As the car drew closer, Jake could hear the engine's hum growing louder. The sound of footsteps outside the warehouse made his pulse quicken. He wasn't going to wait around to see who it was. He grabbed Molly's hand, pulling her up from the floor. "Come on, we need to move now," Jake said, urgency in his voice. Molly didn't question him. She just nodded, clutching onto him tightly. They crept toward the back of the warehouse, trying to make as little noise as possible. Jake's hand tightened around his knife, his senses on high alert. The footsteps outside grew closer, and he knew that whoever it was wasn't going to let them slip by unnoticed. He needed to make a choice. Stay and face whoever was out there, or make a run for it. His instincts told him to run. The car stopped just outside the warehouse, the headlights casting long shadows across the walls. Jake's heart raced as he motioned for Molly to stay quiet. They were trapped in the back corner now, and the only way out was through the front. His mind raced. He had to think fast. A voice echoed from the front of the building, muffled by the walls, but Jake knew it wasn't just anyone. It was a voice he recognized. A voice from his past. "Jake, I know you're in there. Come out, or we'll come in after you," the voice called. Jake's stomach sank. He recognized that voice. It was one of his old contacts from the club. But what was he doing here? Why was he looking for him? And more importantly, why was he bringing this kind of heat to a little girl like Molly? Jake could feel the weight of the situation crashing down on him. His past, the life he had tried to escape, had just come knocking on his door. And now, Molly was caught right in the middle of it. He had no choice but to face it head on. But he wouldn't let them take her. Not without a fight. "Stay close," Jake whispered, pulling Molly behind him. He was about to step out into the open, but just before he did, he heard something that made him freeze. The sound of another voice. A new voice. Someone else was here. It was a split second, but to Jake, it felt like an eternity. The sound of that new voice in the shadows was enough to make his blood run cold. He didn't know who it was, but he could feel the tension in the air. The voice wasn't familiar, but it held a weight to it, a sense of authority that made Jake's instincts flare up. Molly, still huddled close behind him, looked up at him with wide eyes, her fear palpable. "Who is it?" she whispered, barely audible. Jake held up a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. The voice had come from behind them, from a narrow side passage that led further into the warehouse. Whoever it was, they weren't alone. The footsteps from earlier had stopped, and Jake knew he didn't have much time. He had to act. There was no running this time. No escaping his past. He didn't care who had come after him. They weren't going to get Molly. He wasn't going to let that happen. Slowly, carefully, Jake reached for the knife at his side, the familiar weight of it comforting in his hand. His muscles tensed, every fiber of his being alert. Molly's grip on his arm tightened, sensing the danger in the air. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He had to stay focused. He stepped out from the shadows and into the open space of the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. His mind raced as he scanned the room, looking for any signs of movement, any threat. The air was thick with tension. "Jake," the voice called again, this time louder, more demanding. "We know you're here. You can't hide forever." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was one of his old contacts from the Hells Angels. A man named Viper. The last time he had seen Viper, things had ended badly, very badly. Jake had walked away from the club, leaving behind the violence, the chaos, the life he had known. But Viper had always been a force to be reckoned with. He was one of the last people Jake wanted to deal with now. Jake, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Viper's voice came again, this time with a hint of amusement. I know what you've been up to, and I know you've got the girl. Just give her to me, and we can make this all go away. Jake's grip tightened around the knife. This wasn't just about him anymore. Viper wanted Molly. Jake's mind raced, calculating his options. He had to think fast, but he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She's not going anywhere, Jake finally said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of warning. He could hear the movement of footsteps behind him. A few more people had arrived. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't take on a whole group. Not like this. You're making a mistake, Jake, Viper said, his voice now dripping with mockery. You really think you can just walk away from us? You've got one foot in the grave already. And that girl, she's just the leverage we need to bring you back in. Jake's eyes flicked to Molly, still huddled behind him, her small body trembling with fear. He knew she didn't understand all the details, but she could feel the weight of the danger. He had to protect her. He couldn't let her be part of his old life. He had promised himself he wouldn't let anyone else suffer because of the choices he had made. If you think I'm going to hand her over, you're wrong, Jake growled. You don't get to do that. Not anymore. Viper's laugh echoed through the empty space, cruel and harsh. You're a stubborn one, Jake. But it's not up to you anymore. You've been a ghost long enough. Time to come home. Jake's mind raced as Viper's footsteps grew closer. He didn't have much time. The girl was scared. The situation was escalating. There was only one way out now. Jake was done running. He had already made his decision. I'm not going back, Viper, Jake spat. He turned toward Molly, his voice softening. Stay close to me, Molly, he said, his hand reaching out to pull her closer. Molly nodded, fear still in her eyes, but trust beginning to form. She knew Jake wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. He was her protector now. With that, Jake took one last look at the shadows, his grip on the knife tightening. He was ready. Whatever it took, he wasn't going to let them take Molly. He wasn't going to let them take anything from him ever again. The night had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. It was now or never. The moment of truth had arrived. Jake had no more room for hesitation. The sound of Viper's footsteps grew louder, and the shadows around them seemed to close in. Molly clung to his side, her tiny hand gripping his sleeve. She was scared, but there was a quiet strength in her. Jake could feel it, and it made him more determined than ever. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood firm, ready for whatever came next. Jake, Viper called out again, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. You really think you can fight all of us? You don't have a choice here. You can either come with us, or this girl's gonna pay the price. Viper's words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He knew what the man was capable of. He had seen it before. Viper would use anyone, hurt anyone, to get what he wanted. But Jake wasn't going to let him. He wasn't going to let this life consume another innocent person. He had already failed once before, and he wasn't about to make the same mistake again. You won't lay a finger on her, Jake said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tension in the air. Molly looked up at him, her face pale but trusting. I won't let them hurt you, Molly, Jake whispered, more to reassure himself than her. Viper's laughter echoed in the warehouse, harsh and cold. You think you can stop us, Jake? You've been living in the shadows for too long. It's time to face the music. Jake gritted his teeth, his grip tightening around his knife. I'm done with your games, Viper, Jake said, stepping forward, putting himself between Molly and the shadows. I won't let you drag me back into your world. Not again. The words were a declaration, a promise. Viper didn't seem fazed, though. He just stepped forward, his own men trailing behind him, each one carrying that same dangerous air. You really think you can take on all of us, Jake? Viper's tone was mocking, but there was something else there too, fear. Jake could feel it, a crack in the confidence that had once made Viper so intimidating. For a split second, Viper hesitated. It was all Jake needed. Without another word, Jake lunged forward, the knife flashing in his hand. Viper's men moved to intercept, but Jake was quicker, more agile. He dodged the first swing, stepping to the side and landing a punch to the man's stomach. The thug grunted and staggered back. Jake didn't wait for him to recover. He moved toward the next one, every step filled with purpose, every movement fueled by the need to protect Molly. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, but this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure Molly was safe. Viper barked orders, but Jake didn't stop. He was focused, his mind clear. He had faced worse, fought harder, and yet something about this moment, about Molly's trust in him, made him fight like never before. He took down 2 more of Viper's men with swift, calculated moves, leaving them on the ground groaning. Viper watched, eyes wide with disbelief. Jake could see it now. Viper wasn't just angry, he was scared. He never expected Jake to fight back. But Jake had been running from his past for too long. Tonight, he wasn't running anymore. He was done hiding. "You made a mistake coming here, Viper," Jake said, his voice cold and unwavering. "I'm not the same man you remember." Viper, now visibly rattled, took a step back. But Jake wasn't done. He moved toward him, his eyes locked on Viper's. "You should have stayed away," Jake added, his voice low but full of authority. Viper's hands trembled as he reached for his own weapon, but Jake was faster. In one swift motion, he disarmed Viper and threw the weapon to the side. "You don't get to hurt anyone else," Jake said, his tone final. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of their heavy breathing. Viper's men, who had been trying to regroup, now hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had never seen Jake like this. He wasn't the man they had once known. He wasn't afraid anymore. And he wasn't backing down. Molly, still by Jake's side, watched it all, her eyes wide with wonder. She could see the change in him. The strength, the determination, the promise to protect her at all costs. And in that moment, she knew. Jake wasn't just her protector. He was her hero. Viper finally stepped back, his gaze shifting from Jake to the others. He knew he had lost. With one last glare at Jake, he turned and motioned for his men to follow him. They moved reluctantly, their pride wounded but their fear overwhelming. As they retreated into the shadows, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The danger wasn't over, not yet. But for now, they were safe. He turned to Molly, who had been watching everything unfold. She was still trembling, but now there was a hint of relief in her eyes. "It's over," Jake said, kneeling down to her level. "You're safe now." Molly nodded, her lips trembling as she finally spoke. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered. Jake smiled, a rare, soft smile that reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, kid. I told you I'd protect you. And I'm not going anywhere." The warehouse was silent again, but this time, it felt different. They had survived the storm together. And whatever came next, Jake knew he would face it head-on, with Molly by his side. It had been a long night, but the danger wasn't over yet. Jake had expected trouble, but the way things were going, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Molly was safe, for now, but his past had a way of catching up with him when he least expected it. He had made it clear to Viper and his crew that he wasn't going back, but that didn't mean they wouldn't come after him again. Jake looked over at Molly, still sitting on the cold concrete floor, her small face tired but determined. She had seen the violence, had heard the threats, but still, she trusted him. And that trust made everything he had done worth it. He moved over to her, crouching down to her level, his voice soft but firm. "You okay, kid?" Molly looked up at him, her eyes wide but filled with a mixture of fear and respect. She had never seen someone fight like that, never seen anyone stand up for her like Jake had. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Jake. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Jake smiled, though it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not over yet. We need to get out of here, find a safe place." Molly nodded, and Jake stood up, scanning the room. He needed to make a plan, needed to figure out where they could go next. The warehouse was safe, for now, but it was only a matter of time before Viper and his crew found them again. The sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance of the warehouse, making Jake's muscles tense. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The way the footsteps were timed, the way they echoed, there was no mistaking it. He had been expecting this. Slowly, he turned to face the door, the familiar weight of his knife in his hand. Molly's grip on his sleeve tightened. "Jake, who's that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, He watched the shadows move across the floor as the figure stepped into view. It was a man, tall, dressed in all black, his face hidden behind a helmet. Jake's eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure who this was, but he wasn't taking any chances. "Stay behind me," he muttered to Molly, his voice low. The man didn't speak, didn't make a sound as he stepped further into the warehouse. His presence was heavy, intimidating. But Jake wasn't about to back down. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice rough, steady. The man didn't respond immediately, and for a long moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, finally, the man spoke. "You're Jake Morrison, right?" Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his cool. "What's it to you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if sizing him up. "I've been sent to make sure you don't cause any more trouble," he said, his tone cold, businesslike. Jake tensed. Another person sent by Viper? He had hoped this wouldn't happen, that he could keep Molly out of it. But clearly, someone else was looking for him, and it wasn't over yet. "I'm not causing trouble," Jake said, his voice hardening. "I'm just trying to get away from it." The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You can run all you want, but you can't hide forever. You know that, right?" Jake didn't reply, his mind already racing. He had to make a choice. A fight with this guy wasn't something he could avoid, and he couldn't let anyone get to Molly. "What do you want?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low. The man finally took a step forward, his boots heavy against the floor. "Viper wants you back. You've got unfinished business." Jake shook his head, the anger building inside him. "I'm not going back. I told him, I'm done with that life." The man didn't seem surprised. Viper doesn't take no for an answer. Jake's hand tightened around the knife. "Then he's going to have to try harder," he said, his voice sharp. He couldn't back down now. Not with Molly depending on him. The man seemed to consider Jake's words for a moment before he nodded, as if deciding something. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice almost pitying. "You don't know what you're up against." Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man was already backing away, the sound of his boots echoing in the warehouse. "I'll give you one more chance, Morrison," the man said over his shoulder. "But if you keep this up, things are going to get worse for you." With that, he turned and walked out, his footsteps fading into the distance. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't over. He knew that. But for now, he had a little more time. He turned back to Molly, who was still standing behind him, her face full of worry. "You okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. She nodded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Jake, who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't want to answer her directly. She was too young to understand the full truth, the truth that he had been running from for years. "Someone from my past," Jake said, his voice low. "But don't worry. I'm not letting anyone hurt you." Molly didn't respond, but Jake saw the trust in her eyes. She was scared, but she believed him. And that was enough for now. But Jake knew they couldn't stay here much longer. They needed a plan. A way out. A way to disappear for good. It had been hours since the last encounter with Viper's men, and Jake still hadn't let his guard down. Molly had finally managed to fall asleep, but Jake couldn't afford to relax. Every creak of the warehouse, every distant sound from outside made him tense up. He had to keep moving, keep protecting her. The weight of his past was like a shadow hanging over them, and Jake knew it wasn't going to stay away for long. He glanced down at Molly, who lay curled up on a pile of old blankets, her face calm now in sleep. She had been through so much, yet she still trusted him. He couldn't let her down. Not now. The memories of the life he had left behind were starting to come back, uninvited. He had run from the Hells Angels, from everything he had known, but they weren't done with him yet. He knew it. Molly wasn't safe while they were out there, and the longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that Viper and his crew would find them again. He had to move fast. He needed to find a way to get out of the city, get Molly somewhere safe. But every exit seemed blocked. Every plan he thought of seemed to lead them straight into more trouble. He stood up quietly, his boots making no sound as he moved across the concrete floor. The warehouse was a maze of old boxes and broken machinery, but Jake knew this place like the back of his hand now. He had to think. Fast. The sound of a car engine revving outside made him freeze. He quickly moved to the window, peering through the cracked glass. Another car. But this time, it was different. The headlights were off, and the car was moving slowly. Too slowly. Jake's instincts flared, and he moved away from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Molly, who was still asleep, unaware of the danger that was once again closing in on them. "Molly," Jake whispered, kneeling beside her. She stirred but didn't wake. "Molly, wake up. We have to move," he said again, his voice firmer this time. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion written across her face. "Jake? What's happening?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep. "We need to get out of here. Now," Jake said, his tone urgent. Molly didn't ask questions. She could see the seriousness in his eyes. She nodded and scrambled to her feet, still groggy but trusting him completely. Jake grabbed her hand, leading her toward the back of the warehouse. He wasn't sure where they were going yet, but he couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay here. "Stay close," Jake warned her, his eyes scanning the shadows as they moved. He could hear the sound of footsteps again, but this time, it wasn't just one person. It sounded like a small group. His pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. The car outside stopped, and Jake heard the sound of doors opening. He pushed Molly behind a stack of crates, trying to keep them out of sight. His breath was steady, but inside, his mind was racing. He couldn't afford to get caught now. He had to protect her. The footsteps grew louder, and Jake knew that they were coming their way. There was no turning back. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered to Molly, his hand on her shoulder. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The last thing she wanted was for anyone to find them. The shadows outside shifted as the strangers approached the entrance. Jake's mind raced through options. He could try to fight his way out, but with Molly in tow, it wasn't a risk he was willing to take. He had to think of something else. Suddenly, he heard a voice, low and familiar. "Morrison." The voice echoed in the warehouse, a voice he hadn't heard in years. It was deep, gruff, and unmistakable. It was Marcus, one of Jake's old brothers from the club. Jake's body tensed. He had hoped that Marcus wouldn't be involved in this, but here he was, looking for him. He moved cautiously toward the source of the voice, keeping Molly hidden behind him. "Marcus," Jake called out, trying to keep his tone even. "You're not here to hurt me, are you?" There was a pause. Then Marcus's voice broke the silence again. "You really think you can run from us, Jake? We don't just let people go." Jake clenched his fists. "I'm not running. I'm protecting her." He motioned for Molly to stay back, not wanting her to get caught up in this. Marcus stepped out from the shadows, his face rough and scarred, wearing the same leather jacket that marked him as part of the club. But Jake could see something different in his eyes, a hint of regret. "I'm not here to fight you, man," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "But you've got to come with me. Viper's orders." Jake took a step forward, his face hardening. "I'm not going anywhere, Marcus. Not with Viper. Not with anyone." Marcus looked like he was about to argue, but then his gaze flickered to Molly, hidden behind Jake. His expression softened for a moment, then hardened again. "You really think you can protect her from all of this?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp. "You don't know what Viper will do." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to face the reality that he couldn't protect Molly from everyone. But he couldn't back down. "I'll protect her, no matter what," Jake said, his voice fierce. "And I won't let you take her from me." The warehouse was silent, the tension thick in the air. Jake stood his ground, ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Molly's future, and he would fight for it, no matter what it took. It seemed like the world was closing in on Jake. The tension in the air thickened as Marcus stood there, his gaze flickering between Jake and Molly. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in Marcus's eyes, but Jake could see it. The hard resolve, the same fire that had burned in him when he was part of the Hells Angels. Marcus had been a brother, once. But that life was behind him. At least, that's what Jake had convinced himself of. "I didn't want it to go down like this, Jake," Marcus said, his voice low and full of regret. Jake stood firm, his jaw clenched. "Then don't make it happen, Marcus. Don't drag me back into this mess. I'm not going back to Viper, and I'm not going to let him use her." He gestured to Molly, who was still huddled behind him, trembling but silent. Marcus's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, shaking his head. "Viper's not someone you just walk away from. If you don't come with me now, there won't be a later for either of you." Jake's heart pounded. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear the lies, the threats, the promises of what would happen if he didn't comply. He had heard them all before. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about Molly. And Jake wasn't going to let anyone take her. "I'm not running anymore," Jake said, his voice rising with the intensity of the words. I'm standing right here, Marcus. And I'm not going anywhere. Not without her. Marcus looked at him with a mixture of frustration and something else, something Jake couldn't quite read. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unsaid words. Then, without warning, Marcus took a step forward, his hand raised as if to calm the situation. Jake, listen, he said, his voice softer now. You're making a mistake. If you think Viper's just going to walk away, you're wrong. He'll come for you. He'll come for her. He motioned to Molly again, his gaze hardening. He'll destroy everything in his path to get what he wants. Jake's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of those words, the truth behind them. But he couldn't let fear dictate his actions anymore. Let him come, Jake growled, his voice cold. I'm done running. I'm done being afraid. Marcus took a step back, his expression darkening. You really think you can protect her? You really think you can keep her safe from all of this? The doubt in his voice hit Jake like a punch to the gut, but he stood tall, unwavering. I've protected her once already, Marcus, Jake said firmly, locking eyes with his old friend. And I'll do it again, no matter what. The tension in the room hung like a thick fog. Molly was still behind Jake, silent but watching, her small face full of fear but also trust. She was waiting for him to make it right. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. I'm not going anywhere, Marcus, Jake repeated. You can go back to Viper, or you can walk away. But I'm done with that life. And I won't let you drag me back into it. Marcus's eyes flickered with something. Anger, frustration, maybe even respect. But he didn't move. He didn't answer. The standoff lasted a few more moments, the air heavy with tension. Then, finally, Marcus exhaled sharply. You've got guts, Jake, he muttered under his breath. But this isn't over. Viper won't stop. Jake didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. He just watched as Marcus turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps growing fainter. Jake didn't lower his guard. He didn't trust that this was over. Not by a long shot. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had time. As the door slammed shut behind Marcus, Jake turned back to Molly. She was still standing there, her eyes wide, her small hands shaking. But there was something else there too, hope. She had seen him stand up for her. She had seen him fight. And maybe, just maybe, she believed that they could make it through this together. You're safe, kid, Jake said, his voice softening as he knelt down to her level. I told you, no one's going to hurt you. Not while I'm here. Molly looked up at him, her eyes filled with something more than fear. She was starting to believe him. Thank you, she whispered. Jake smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The danger wasn't gone. He knew that. But for now, he had her trust. And that was enough to keep him going. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Jake's mind raced. He had to come up with a plan, but his options were limited. Viper wasn't going to let this go, and neither were his men. The clock was ticking, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him again. But this time, he wasn't going to wait for them. He was going to take the fight to them. He would protect Molly, and he would do whatever it took to make sure no one else got hurt. This time, it was different. This time, he wasn't running. It had been hours since Marcus had left, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. Every second that ticked by felt like a countdown, each moment closer to the inevitable confrontation. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't stay in the warehouse much longer. He couldn't keep Molly hidden here forever. The walls felt like they were closing in. Jake paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had to think. He had to come up with a plan. He glanced over at Molly, who was sitting on the makeshift bed of old blankets in the corner, her face still pale, but calmer now. Her trust in him, despite everything, made him feel like he had to do whatever it took to keep her safe. We need to move, Jake said, breaking the silence, his voice low and steady. Molly looked up at him, confusion in her eyes. Move where? She asked. I'm not sure yet, but we can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Jake's heart clenched at the thought of what she had already been through, but he knew he couldn't let her stay in this warehouse. It wasn't safe anymore. He needed to get them both out of the city, away from Viper and his crew. But where will we go? Molly asked, her voice trembling slightly. We'll figure it out, Jake replied, offering a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. We just have to stay ahead of them. We'll find somewhere safe. The truth was, he had no idea where that would be. His mind kept circling back to the same thought. He couldn't go back to the old life. He had walked away from the Hell's Angels, and that life was behind him now. But no matter how far he ran, his past kept chasing him, pulling him back into the chaos he had fought so hard to escape. It wasn't just Viper. It was everything he had done, all the people he had hurt, all the violence he had left in his wake. And now, it was catching up to him. He couldn't let that happen to Molly. She deserved better. He wouldn't let her get caught in the crossfire. "We'll get through this, Molly," Jake said, his voice firm, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Molly nodded, her eyes still full of uncertainty, but she trusted him. That was all that mattered right now. Jake didn't know how much time they had before Viper's men came looking for them again. It could be hours, or it could be minutes. He had no way of knowing. But he couldn't afford to wait around and find out. "Let's go," he said, standing up and extending his hand to Molly. She took it without hesitation, standing up and following him as he made his way to the back of the warehouse. He moved quickly, his senses alert, constantly scanning for any signs of danger. The quiet of the place felt unnatural, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. As they reached the back door, Jake paused, listening for any sounds outside. He heard nothing. It was too quiet. He opened the door just enough to peek outside, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. Empty. It was too quiet. He motioned for Molly to follow him, and they stepped outside, careful not to make any noise. The night air was cold, the streets eerily silent. Jake led Molly down the alley, staying close to the walls, keeping to the shadows. They were in a part of the city that Jake knew well, an area he had avoided for years. It was the kind of place where people disappeared, and Jake had spent a lot of time in places like this, in the dark corners of the city, where the rules didn't apply. He hated that it had come to this, that Molly was now part of this world, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. He had failed her already, by bringing her into this mess, by not getting to her in time before the danger found them. But he wouldn't fail her again. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. As they moved through the streets, Jake's mind raced. He needed to find a way out of the city, somewhere Viper and his men wouldn't be able to find them. Somewhere Molly could be safe. But there were no safe places anymore. Everywhere Jake looked, he saw danger. He had burned every bridge, left every connection behind when he walked away from the Hell's Angels. And now he was paying the price for it. He couldn't trust anyone, not even Marcus. Especially not Marcus. The sound of distant sirens cut through the night, a reminder that no matter how fast they ran, they would never be truly free. Not unless Jake faced the consequences of his past. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't outrun it forever. "Jake," Molly whispered, her voice shaky as she tugged on his sleeve. He turned to look at her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes full of uncertainty. For a moment, Jake didn't know how to answer. But then he smiled, a rare smile that reached his eyes this time. "We'll be okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Not ever." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake believed it. They had a long road ahead, and the danger wasn't over. But together, they would face whatever came next. Jake would protect her. He had to. For her, and for himself. It had been hours since they left the warehouse, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The streets had grown quieter, the night colder, but the uneasy silence was deafening. Every passing car, every footstep in the distance felt like a threat. He kept his eyes on Molly, who was walking close behind him, her small hand gripping his sleeve. She had been quiet since they left, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. He could feel it too, that weight pressing down on them. He had to keep moving. He had to keep them both ahead of whatever was coming. The thought of Viper still lingered in his mind like a bad taste. Jake knew this wasn't over. Viper wouldn't let him go that easily. And he wouldn't stop coming for Molly. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. "Jake," Molly's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and uncertain. "Where are we going?" Jake looked down at her, seeing the worry in her eyes. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his own eyes. "We're just getting out of the city, kid. I'll figure out where to go once we're safe." Molly nodded, but Jake could tell she wasn't convinced. She had seen too much, had heard too many things she shouldn't have. But he had to keep her calm, keep her focused. "We'll be okay," Jake said, the words coming out more as a promise to himself than to her. He had to believe it. "Just stay close." They kept walking through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Jake tried to focus on the path ahead, but his mind kept drifting back. To the past. The Hells Angels, the violence, the chaos. He had walked away from all of it, but it wasn't done with him. The city was full of people who didn't forget easily, and Viper wasn't the type to let someone go without consequences. But he couldn't go back. Not now. Not when he had Molly to protect. The city was vast, but Jake knew the right people to go to. The question was, who could he trust? He had burned bridges with everyone from his old life. And even if he found someone willing to help, would they do it for free? No, Jake wasn't going to ask for help. Not unless it was absolutely necessary. He'd figure this out on his own, just like he always had. As they neared a corner, Jake stopped suddenly, sensing something in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Molly stopped beside him, her hand still gripping his sleeve. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't respond immediately. He was listening, trying to hear any sign of movement, any hint of danger. But there was nothing. The streets were still, too still. He motioned for Molly to stay behind him as he slowly moved toward the corner. He peered around it, his eyes scanning the street. No one. He let out a slow breath, his hand still gripping the knife at his side. He turned back to Molly. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. Molly nodded, her fear now palpable. Jake could see it in her eyes. She was scared, but she trusted him. That trust was something he didn't take lightly. He would protect her. He had to. They continued walking, keeping to the shadows, moving quickly but carefully. The city felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake kept his senses on high alert, always checking over his shoulder, always scanning the darkened streets for any signs of movement. It was only a matter of time before they came for him, before Viper came for them. But for now, they were safe. For now. "Jake," Molly said again, breaking the silence. "How long are we going to keep running?" Jake glanced down at her, his eyes softening. "I don't know, kid," he replied honestly. "I don't know how long we can run. But as long as we're moving, we're safer than if we just stay in one place." Molly was quiet for a moment. "Then, what if we don't make it?" The question hit Jake harder than he expected. He had spent so much time focused on keeping her safe, but he had never stopped to think about what would happen if they couldn't outrun the danger. "We will make it," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Molly. I promise." Molly didn't respond, but the fear in her eyes seemed to ease just a little. She believed him, and that was enough for Jake. He kept moving, determined to find a way out of this mess, to get them both somewhere safe. The road ahead wasn't clear, but he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when he had a promise to keep. And not when the people who had hurt her were still out there. As they moved deeper into the city, Jake's thoughts raced. Where could they go? Who could they trust? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. But first, he had to keep them both alive. He had to stay one step ahead of Viper. And that was easier said than done. But Jake wasn't afraid of him. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. He had found something worth fighting for. He had found someone worth protecting. And nothing was going to take that away from him. It had been hours since they left the familiar streets of the city, and now, Jake could feel the weight of every step. The night had grown colder, and the silence between him and Molly had become suffocating. He kept his eyes forward, scanning the streets, constantly alert for any sign of trouble. He had to keep moving, no matter what. Every time his foot hit the pavement, Jake's mind raced with thoughts of how to protect Molly. Viper wouldn't stop until he had them, and that much was clear. But Jake was done running. He wouldn't let anyone hurt her, not again. The city was vast, and the night was their cover, but it also worked against them. Jake could feel the danger lurking around every corner. "Jake, where are we going?" Molly's voice cut through his thoughts, soft but filled with uncertainty. He turned to look at her, trying to offer a reassuring smile. But the truth was, he wasn't sure himself. He had no plan, just an overwhelming sense that they couldn't stay where they were for long. "We'll find somewhere safe, Molly," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We just have to keep moving." She nodded, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. She had seen too much, and a child's trust could only go so far when the world around them was falling apart. Jake's heart ached at the thought of what she'd been through. She was too young for this life. He wished he could give her something normal, something she deserved. But normal wasn't an option anymore. "How do you know we'll be safe?" Molly asked again, her voice tinged with fear. Jake stopped walking, turning to face her. He crouched down to her level, making sure she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Because I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, Molly. I promise." She studied him for a moment, her young eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. Finding none, she gave a small nod, her fear easing just a little. But Jake could still feel the weight of the world pressing down on both of them. They couldn't stop now. Not with Viper out there. Not with her life hanging in the balance. They had to keep moving. They had to find a way out of the city, somewhere safe. Jake stood up, taking her hand once more, and they continued walking, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The further they moved, the less familiar the surroundings became. This part of the city was foreign to Jake. It wasn't a place he frequented, but it was quiet. Too quiet. And quiet meant danger. He had learned that the hard way. He kept his senses sharp, every instinct telling him to stay alert. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, and he knew he wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as they turned a corner. In the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was too dark to make out any details, but Jake's instincts flared. He tightened his grip on Molly's hand, ready for whatever came next. The figure stepped forward, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the silhouette. It was another man from his past, a man he hadn't seen in years. Jake's first instinct was to keep moving, to get Molly out of there as fast as possible, but the man called out to him, his voice carrying through the empty street. "Jake," the man shouted. "I know it's you." Jake froze. He didn't want to face anyone from his old life, not now. Not with Molly by his side. But there was no escaping it. He couldn't outrun his past forever. Slowly, he turned to face the man, keeping Molly behind him. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice low and wary. The man stepped closer, his face coming into view. Jake's heart tightened. It was Sean, an old member of the Hells Angels. Sean had always been a wild card, unpredictable, dangerous. Jake knew him well enough to know that if Sean was here, it wasn't good news. "I'm not here to hurt you, Jake," Sean said, his voice surprisingly calm. "But you've got to listen to me. Viper's coming. He's got people looking for you." Jake's grip tightened on Molly's hand. He wasn't sure whether he could trust Sean, but one thing was clear, Viper was close. And they didn't have much time. "Why should I trust you?" Jake asked, his voice still low but laced with suspicion. Sean's eyes darted to Molly, then back to Jake. "I know you're trying to protect her, Jake," he said. "But you can't do it alone. Viper's too powerful. I've seen what he's capable of. He won't stop until he has you both." Jake's heart hammered in his chest. The thought of Viper getting to Molly was unbearable. "I won't let him take her," Jake growled. Sean sighed, a heavy, regretful sound. "I'm not saying you're wrong, Jake. But you need help, and I can give it to you. You've got to get out of the city, and I know a place where you can hide. It's the only way you'll stay safe." Jake hesitated. He didn't want to trust anyone, especially someone from his past. But the reality was that he couldn't do this alone. Molly needed protection, and they couldn't stay in the open much longer. After a long pause, Jake nodded, his decision made. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Take us to this place. But if you're lying to me, I won't hesitate." Sean nodded, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "You have my word. Let's go before it's too late." Jake turned to Molly, his expression softening as he knelt down to her level. "We're going to be okay," he said. "I'm getting you out of here." Molly nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. Together, they followed Sean into the night, the danger still looming over them. But for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like they had a chance. A chance to escape, to be free, and to keep the promise he had made to protect Molly. They weren't safe yet, but they were one step closer. It had been hours since Sean led them into the unknown, and with each step, Jake could feel the weight of the danger that still loomed over them. Molly had fallen asleep against the wall of the rundown building Sean had brought them to, her body curled up for warmth, but Jake couldn't afford the luxury of rest. Every noise in the building, every creak of the floorboards made him tense, his hand never leaving the handle of the knife at his side. Sean had promised this place was safe, but Jake wasn't taking anything for granted. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in. The shadows weren't just from the night. They were from his past, from the people who wouldn't stop until they found him. Viper was out there, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before his crew closed in. Jake turned his attention back to the room they were in. It wasn't much, just an abandoned storage unit that smelled like old wood and dust, but it was a temporary refuge. The walls were made of metal, thick and rusted, but at least it was quiet. Jake needed this time to think, to plan, and most importantly, to keep Molly safe. The low hum of the city outside reminded him that they were far from hidden, but at least for now, no one seemed to be looking for them here. Sean had set up a small camp in the corner, but Jake couldn't relax. He had learned long ago not to trust anyone from his past, even if they had offered help when it seemed like there was nowhere else to turn. Sean was one of the few people still alive from his time with the Hells Angels. If Sean wanted to help, Jake had no choice but to let him, but that didn't mean Jake trusted him. The thought of Viper and his men coming for them again made Jake's chest tighten. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let Molly get caught up in this fight. His mind wandered to what he'd do next. If he stayed in the city, they'd be found. He had burned every bridge, left behind every connection, but Viper wouldn't stop hunting him. Leaving wasn't an option, not yet. He needed to think of something. Molly stirred in her sleep, and Jake snapped back to the present. She looked so peaceful now, like the world wasn't closing in around them. He hated the fact that she had to live through this. She was just a kid. She deserved a life of normalcy, not to be dragged through the chaos he had created. But it was too late. This was the life she had now, and Jake would do whatever it took to protect her. He had made a promise. She deserves better than this, Jake muttered to himself. Sean, who had been sitting quietly across the room, looked up at him. She does, he said quietly. But you're doing the best you can, Jake. You've got her out of the worst part of it. You'll keep her safe. Jake didn't respond. He wasn't sure Sean was right. How do you know Viper's not just using me to get to her? Jake asked, his voice low and filled with distrust. Sean didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh the question carefully before replying. Because if he was, he would have already gone after her, Sean said. He's after you, Jake. Always has been. Jake looked at Sean, his jaw tightening. And why should I trust you? You don't have to trust me, Sean said, standing up and walking over to where Jake sat. But you can trust that I'm not the enemy. You know me better than that. Jake looked up at Sean, seeing the weariness in his eyes, the signs of a man who had been through the same kind of battles. Fine, Jake muttered, his voice tight. But I'm still not trusting anyone but myself when it comes to her. Sean nodded, acknowledging Jake's words without argument. I get it. But you're not alone in this. We all have our pasts. We all have our demons. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake knew that Sean's past was just as dark as his own, maybe even darker. I just want her safe, Jake said, his voice softer now, the anger and distrust fading a little. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she is. Sean gave a small, understanding nod. Then let me help. Let me get you both out of here when the time is right. You're not going to win this fight on your own. Jake knew Sean was right, but admitting it felt like a failure. He had spent so many years running, doing things on his own, that asking for help felt like weakness. But for Molly, he had to put aside his pride. All right, Jake said quietly. Let's figure out a way out of this mess. We can't stay here long. Sean's eyes shifted, and he seemed to consider something before speaking again. I know a guy. Someone who can get you out of the city. But we have to move quickly. Viper's crew won't stop looking for you. Jake stood up, looking down at Molly one more time. She was still asleep, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. He could hear the distant sounds of the city, but for the first time that night, it didn't feel like they were running. It felt like they had a chance. A real chance to get out of this alive. Let's go, Jake said, his voice firm. We leave at first light. No more running. He turned to Sean. And you better keep your word. Sean gave him a small smile, his face serious now. I will. I'll get you both out of here. And with that, Jake felt a small sense of hope stir in him. They had a plan. They had a way out. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. It was still dark when Jake and Molly, along with Sean, slipped out of the abandoned building and into the cool morning air. The city was quiet, eerily so, and Jake could feel the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had made it through the worst, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. Not now. Not with Molly counting on him. Sean had led them to a secluded spot at the edge of town, a hidden garage tucked away from the prying eyes of Viper's men. It was a place that only a few trusted people knew about, and Jake was grateful for it. "This is the last stop before we leave the city," Sean said as he led them into the dimly lit garage. "I've got a guy here who can get you out of the country. He's got a boat waiting at the docks. You'll be out of here before anyone even knows you're gone." Jake nodded, though the lingering feeling of unease never quite left. He could still hear Viper's voice in his head, threatening to hunt him down, to make him pay for walking away. But he wasn't about to back down now. "How do you know we can trust this guy?" Jake asked, his voice gruff but controlled. Sean met his gaze, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I trust him," he said simply. "That's all that matters." Jake looked over at Molly, who was still clinging to him, her face pale but filled with quiet determination. She had been through more than any child should ever have to endure, and Jake swore to himself that he would get her to safety, no matter the cost. "We'll be safe, kid," Jake murmured to Molly, his voice softer than usual. "I promise you." Molly nodded, her eyes wide with trust, though the uncertainty was still there, lingering behind the calm exterior. Jake reached down and gently squeezed her hand. "We'll get through this," he said, more to reassure himself than her. The world outside felt like it was falling apart, but inside this garage, it was just the three of them, Jake, Molly, and Sean. For a brief moment, they were all just people, not fugitives, not targets, just survivors. But the calm was fleeting. "All right," Sean said, breaking the silence. "The boat's ready. Let's move. We don't have much time." Jake nodded, his heart beating a little faster as they moved toward the back of the garage. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the anticipation of what was coming. This was it. They were leaving everything behind, starting over. As they stepped into the alleyway behind the garage, Jake's instincts flared. The air felt charged, heavy. He stopped, motioning for Sean and Molly to keep moving. The street was deserted, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. He scanned the shadows, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side. He wasn't about to let anyone surprise him. Then, he heard it. A distant sound, the faint rumble of an engine, getting closer. "Get down," Jake hissed, pushing Molly behind a dumpster, his body shielding hers. "Stay quiet." Sean did the same, crouching low as they waited, their breath shallow. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer. Jake could feel his pulse in his ears, his heart pounding in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity. The car turned the corner, headlights cutting through the dark. It was slow at first, but then the car sped up. Jake held his breath. The car slowed to a stop just a few feet away. Jake's grip tightened on the knife. They couldn't afford to be seen. He looked at Sean, who gave him a small nod. It wasn't just the engine. It was the footsteps. Jake's stomach dropped. They weren't alone. "Get ready," Jake whispered to Molly, his voice urgent. Molly nodded, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes wide with fear but determination. Jake moved silently, keeping close to the shadows. He was ready for anything. The car's engine cut off, and the doors slammed open. Two figures stepped out, their silhouettes dark against the faint light. "I don't know, man," one of them said, his voice rough. "I thought I saw something." "Let's check it out," the other replied. "We can't be too careful." Jake's heart raced. Viper's men. They had found them. He had to act, and fast. He motioned for Sean and Molly to stay hidden, then moved into position. There was no time for hesitation. He had to protect Molly. He couldn't let them get to her. He took a deep breath, then sprang into action, rushing toward the nearest man. The first guy barely had time to react before Jake tackled him to the ground, the knife in his hand flashing in the dim light. The man let out a strangled cry, but Jake was already on top of him, the blade pressed against his throat. "Stay down," Jake hissed. "Stay quiet." The second man turned at the sound, his eyes widening in shock. But Jake was already moving, his hand reaching for the gun at his waist. In one smooth motion, he disarmed the second man, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him against the wall. "Don't move," Jake said, his voice cold. "You'll both live if you don't make a sound." The two men stood frozen, too shocked to do anything. Jake kept them in check, glancing over his shoulder at Sean and Molly. "Go," he ordered. "Now." They didn't hesitate. Sean grabbed Molly's hand and pulled her along, disappearing down the alley. Jake followed quickly, his mind already moving to the next step. The boat was their ticket out. It was their chance at freedom. And no one, not Viper or his men, was going to stop him from getting Molly to safety. As they rounded the corner, the sound of footsteps behind them faded. The tension didn't lift, but Jake felt something he hadn't in a long time. A glimmer of hope. They were getting out. Together. And no one could take that away from them. In this gripping tale of survival and redemption, we dive deep into the world of a man who has left behind the notorious life of the Hells Angels, only to find that escaping his past is not as simple as walking away. This heart-pounding story unfolds as a former member must protect a young girl from the shadows of his past, where danger lurks around every corner. With each chapter, the stakes grow higher, and the struggle to stay ahead of relentless enemies intensifies. The journey takes them through dark alleys, abandoned buildings, and dangerous encounters, as Jake fights to keep the girl safe. As we follow the twists and turns of this powerful narrative, we are reminded of the harsh realities of life within the Hells Angels stories, where loyalty, betrayal, and survival collide. But there is hope. Jake has made a promise to the girl, and he will stop at nothing to fulfill it. The bond between them becomes the driving force behind his actions, pushing him to confront his demons and face the dangers that refuse to let him go. In a world where the past never stays buried for long, these Hells Angels stories show how far one man will go to protect what's most important to him. Each step they take brings them closer to freedom, but also closer to those who wish to see them fail. Will they make it out alive, or will the ghosts of Jake's past finally catch up with them? Tune in to find out as the thrilling Hells Angels stories continue to unfold, proving that no one is ever truly free from their past.